All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about BizTalk migration with a couple experts here that are going to help us on this particular journey. My name is Kent Weir. I'm a Principal Product Manager on the Azure Logic Apps team, and I'm joined by a couple MVPs. And maybe Mike, let's start with you if you want to just do a brief introduction.
Hi everybody, Mike Stephenson here. I'm based over in Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, so up sort of the north end of the UK. I've worked with BizTalk from, I think the first time I ever used it was the very first version of BizTalk. So I've worked with it for years, been in a BizTalk MVP, but then the last sort of 10 years or 12 years, I've been predominantly working with Azure. And then I do a lot of sort of bypass type integration with Azure, and naturally, as part of that, BizTalk migration for customers who've been on BizTalk going to Azure is something that I'm involved in.
Awesome. Now, how about you, Stephen?
Oh, hi, my name is Stephen Thomas. I'm based out of Austin, Texas, and I'm just approaching my 22nd year anniversary for starting to work with BizTalk Server. So I'm pretty excited about that. Of course, the past 5 or more years, I've been more focused on Microsoft Cloud technologies. I've been recognized as an MVP by Microsoft for the past 18 years now, and I am really motivated about Microsoft-based integration solutions. So thank you.
Awesome, thanks. So that's awesome. I was actually on a call yesterday with someone, and they had first started with BizTalk in 1999.
Wow.
So that's probably not too far from when you started as well, but it is that's awesome to hear. So what we want to talk a little bit today is Stephen and Michael plus one other fellow, Sandro, who needs no introduction. We constructed a Azure migration, or sorry, BizTalk migration to Azure Integration Services architecture guidance, and I'll share a link to this content in the video description. But this is a great resource for planning your BizTalk server migration, and you can see all of the various areas that we do talk about in the paper about the benefits of migration, an introduction to Azure Integration Services, how you should sort of compare and contrast some of the concepts in each of these different platforms. And then also when we think about Azure, there's a lot of options when it comes to technology, and we try to give you some prescriptive guidance about, what technology to use when. We talked a little bit about like planning your project, how you should think about going about that particular initiative. And then we also include some best practices and talk a little bit about roadmap. And so this is a great resource that you folks can go ahead and learn more about. And what we wanted to do today was we wanted to have a little bit of a Ask the Experts type session and just, talk more about these concepts as opposed to just having to read about it as well. So what we're going to do, I've constructed a series of questions, and we're going to go ahead and lean on all of this expertise that we just heard about. And give folks a little bit more perspective on how you should go about migrating from BizTalk Server to Azure Integration Services. So maybe, Mike, let's start with you. What are some examples of BizTalk migrations that you've been involved in, and what was the biggest driver for customers for wanting to do this?
Mm-hmm. So I think if you imagine like my history, originally, I don't know, let's say 12 years ago, most of the work I was doing was just vanilla BizTalk, and then I had a lot of companies who I'd work with where they're doing new greenfield integration on Azure and exploring those new options. And what we had for a long time was companies who would do a bit of both. So they might already have BizTalk, they're trying to do new stuff on Azure, and then they're trying to combine the two of them together. So we had this long period of time where you'd have that hybrid integration where you'd have BizTalk calling out to Logic Apps reaching through hybrid connections and gateways and stuff to integrate in, and kind of using the two side by side. But I think more recently, there's a shift now where companies are kind of recognizing that Microsoft, while BizTalk doesn't necessarily have an end of life deadline or anything yet, it's not getting any innovation on it anymore. It's stable. It's just does its job. But actually, the new investments from Microsoft are all in the cloud, and also the new integration patterns and types of project people are doing are better suited to cloud anyway because of cost models and scalability models. So I think a lot of customers are starting to recognize that it makes a lot of sense to move their BizTalk investments up to Azure in manners that make sense. So I think, to me, that kind of covers some of the drivers. It's all about, reducing costs, getting better value for money, and new kinds of projects that you want to do. And also, the biggest thing probably is skills as well. People don't really want to work with BizTalk because it's kind of a legacy skill set now. You're not going to find many people wanting to go and I really want to learn BizTalk as something new. And I think demand for those skills is going to be difficult in the future because everybody wants to use Azure. And I think that's where and recognizing that integration on Azure is not just logic apps, it's logic apps, API management, service bus functions. You've got Power Automate and RPA type projects. So integration is just a much bigger thing these days, and I think that's really where customers are going.
No, some excellent points there. And Stephen, I guess same question for you. Like, what are some examples of BizTalk migrations, and what's some of the drivers from your perspective or your customer's perspective that's helped move that?
Yeah, so my current client that I'm at now, I've started about 1.5 years ago at this client, and they were just finishing up what is probably one of the largest BizTalk migrations that I've ever heard of. They were doing a 2-year full migration from BizTalk 2013 R2 totally to Azure Integration Services. They were moving hundreds and hundreds of applications, BizTalk applications over to the cloud platform. It was a unique opportunity to see the thought process they went through in deciding on making the move, the cost justifications, how they were projecting cost savings, of 20, 30, 40% over time. Their key driving factors were a lot like Mike said. They saw the vision of the cloud. They saw new connectors being built, almost on a monthly basis, as compared to kind of some of the, I want to say limitations, but the small set of out-of-the-box connectors compared to cloud technologies that you have with BizTalk Server. Another key driving factor was the cost of implementation of a solution. So I've heard BizTalk called a lot of things, but being simple to develop on is definitely not one of them. The same cannot really be said about a lot of the Azure technologies. It's very intuitive, has a very low code or no code approach, which makes it very simple for resources to build new solutions. And they found that important. They also liked that their investment in BizTalk Server in terms of schemas and maps, a lot of that stuff could be reused. So flat file schemas, XML schemas could be reused, and maps as well, but it did take some tweaking. But they did get a lot of reuse out of the maps as well.
Oh, great to hear. And I think there's a couple of things that sort of stood out for me. I think, Mike, back to you, it was the sort of the landscape of integration has changed a lot. And I thought you gave some like great examples of how, now there's just, more things, more surface area to do integration or even automation as well. And I think like the convergence of those things gets quite interesting. And then also, Stephen, super interesting to hear about the ROI, or basically some of the financial benefits of going down this path as well. So great answers. Sorry, Mike, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to kind of touch on a point Stephen made. I thought just to see what you guys think. I mean, a lot of the interfaces we build now, that point about the connectors being different that people tend to use. If you think what were the best adapters in BizTalk was SQL, SAP, file adapters, and those legacy protocols. But HTTP was always a bit sort of, let's be really blunt, it wasn't the best experience in BizTalk, especially for things like REST connectors. And I think, if you look at logic apps, those RESTful connectors, whether they be just the HTTP or the out-of-the-box API connectors, it's just such a better experience for connecting. And there's so many more apps that use HTTP as a protocol than there were back when most people were doing hardcore BizTalk stuff. And I think that the biggest change to me is, you think about the experience level of people building real-world integrations with logic apps. It's, you've got people who are literally grads straight out of school building production ready, good quality logic apps, that was really difficult to do with BizTalk. You always needed a highly experienced person for anything that was remotely risky. Whereas now, I'm not saying that the problem's completely gone away, but it's much easier to get somebody delivering real world code. It's about delivering value quickly and at low cost and making it easy to change, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think it's like there's no substitute for having some expertise, like the experience that you folks bring. But I think having a tool that is more approachable makes a world of difference. And I've seen this like with my own eyes, like outside of Microsoft. I'll give him a bit of a shout out, but like there's a person named Josh Cook who's now an MVP, and he was someone that I had hired at the energy company just out of school, and he picked it up and was productive very early, and his career started to like take off. So it's definitely possible. It's actually pretty cool to see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right,
to that point, I mean, it's made me have to shift things I focus on. Because as Mike said in the past, you had to hire people like us to get your BizTalk solutions done. Now I've had to focus a lot more on architecture, and high level, team management than actual delivery. So.
For sure, it does take a little bit of a mindset, but I think if someone is still continuing and interesting to learn, they'll always be able to find some interesting work to do.
I think it's that idea of, can I build a production logic app in a day, 2 days? Yes. Can you do that with BizTalk? Any chance?
Can't even install it in that time.
On your dev box.
Okay, so next question. So Stephen, we'll start with you this time. So if you were to start, you're working with a brand new customer, how would you start the migration? What might be some activities that you would start with if you were, say, the project architect in that role?
Yeah, so I kind of look at what types of integration are we doing? Are we doing, HTTP-based integration? Are we doing file? Are we integrating with external trading partners? Is it all internal communication, SAP, whatnot? I look at what different features we use. Are we using the SSO? Are we using a lot of transforms? Are we using a lot of custom components? And I really look at our core integration components that we have in our BizTalk environment, and I try to map them as best I can to core features in Azure Integration Services. I've seen some people try to force everything into a logic gap, for example, when there's a lot of integration solutions that you build in BizTalk that might not use logic gaps at all when you move them to the cloud. API management is extremely powerful in what it can do. Combine that with Service Bus and Key Vault, and you can build a lot of complex integration scenarios and solutions that we really had to need full BizTalk Server to do in the past. So I try to make people understand that it's not always just a move to logic apps. It's taking into account all Azure features. Also look beyond what is just outlined as Azure Integration Services, and that's not with just your only tools in your toolbox. You can leverage everything that goes even beyond that. So it's really not try to force specific technology on your solution, and kind of modeling what's going to be best for your solution.
And a bit of a shameless plug. So we do cover this in that architecture guidance paper that I talked about previously. Mike actually was the person that put together a great diagram that will help you with this mapping. And then we also have like some additional verbiage that helps with it as well. And so, if it's, I think what Stephen had mentioned was super important about essentially establishing inventory of sort of what you're using and sort of how you're using it, and then being able to map that into, let's call it the new world. And we definitely have some content to help with that in the document itself. I guess, Mike, anything to add? Anything you would say differently? I know you've spent a lot of time in this area as well.
Yeah, I'm just kind of trying to think about making sure I don't answer the next question in this question. But I think that the key thing, I guess, when you start is it's like thinking about what are the things that are going to make you successful, and what are the things that are going to give you big pain problems. So to me, you've got to assess your BizTalk estate, what you've got now, understand where your risks are, like a lot of companies with BizTalk that I've seen over the years, some of them don't even know what they've got on their BizTalk, you could argue. Some of them don't know, even if they forget Logic App migration, if they did a BizTalk upgrade, some of them wouldn't know how to test half the BizTalk apps they've got. So you've got to look for those risks and work out how you'll mitigate them. And then you've got to think about, that's your current state assessment, but there's also on your new platform, what are you going to do that'll make you successful? So to me, I'm a big fan of companies building stuff in a similar way. So let's say we had 2 or 3 Logic App solutions. I hate it when they're built in a way where every one of them is so different that you couldn't just take a developer who's worked on one, give them the other app, and then it's like relearning everything from day one. So you need some standardization, which is something I kind of try to promote with customers for functions, API management, Logic Apps, whatever. Build some consistent ways, and we often refer to it as like a sort of factory assembly line approach. So we have a way we build Logic Apps, a way we build functions, etc. And we try to build them all in the same way, even though they might functionally do different things. And with that, you've got to think about things like, well, how am I going to do login diagnostics? How am I going to do testing? How am I going to do deployments? And all those things. And like it may be a bit counterproductive in that you want to do your migration as quick as possible, but that investment in getting a good solid foundation that's going to work for you, doing that up front or pay dividends so many times over, not just in the migration, but in future projects that you build, because that standardization will lower the cost of ownership of your code and everything. So I think that to me is the 2 important areas when you first start off. If you don't do that well, you're just going to have problems later.
Yeah, and we talk a little bit about this in the paper as well, and this wasn't planned, but I like how this is shaping up here, because it's almost like there's what we call it as like in terms of like having some sprints, and like having some sprints to like focus on your foundation, and then allow for a little bit of remediation time, because you don't want to get too far down the line and then go, wait a minute. How do we do this? How do we do this? And you've got sort of this need, and actually kind of leads into our next question, and we'll start with you, Mike, is, so in BizTalk, there was a lot of reusable components people would build. It could be adapters. It could be some sort of like utilities that access SSO. It could be some like helper classes that are used for logging or caching or other things. So as customers may have some of those reusable components, like how should they think about those when moving to the cloud, and what might be some opportunities for them there?
Oh yeah, I think it's a really great question. I think when we think of the architecture guidance we've done so far, really the next steps providing patterns and practices to help customers solve some of these common problems and approaches, and then even we could even have assets people can use, a bit like marketplace or building blocks they can get. But I think you've got to think about certain things like what are your common pipeline components, what are your common business rules, how are you going to handle mapping? You've got multiple different ways of doing mapping in Logic Apps, whether you use an integration account, you put it in the app itself. Do you want to have that centralized mapping capability or decentralized? And then I think one of the big things with Logic Apps as well is the idea of shared Logic Apps. So you can call one workflow from another, and then in consumption, that works really well because you can call kind of any Logic app in your subscription, but in standard, at the minute, you can only do it within the context of an app. You can't call across Logic apps at the minute, so it's understanding some of those limitations and where you'd work around them, because you definitely could call one app to another if you did it via API management, for example, and you have some kind of decoupling, or you could do it via service bus as an example. But I think it's really as part of your assessment of your current estate, you want to work out what your shared components are, and then work out where would they fit in your new model. So it might be the case, let's say you've got a business rule. Well, one of the challenges is we don't really have full support at the minute on Azure integration for business rules kind of as is, but I know that's been something that's been talked about quite a lot, and there may be stuff down the line, but question is, well, do you want to run that in your rule? Do you want to move it to being a function? Could it live in API management? Could it be a workflow on its own? Do you want to maybe try and host the rules engine in .NET Code or something like that? I know people have done before as well. And then things like your pipeline components. Well, you've got to think about the biggest architecture difference between Azure Integration and BizTalk is the concept of streaming versus buffering, which I think a lot of people don't really talk about very much. But in a pipeline component, because it's a streaming component, you can act on quite a big message, process it through a pipeline component, do some kind of decoding or manipulation of the data as it goes through and it hits the message box. Now, that concept you can't really do with something like a logic app, or you can maybe do it with a function. Arguably, you've got things like timeout challenges to think about. But if you need that streaming concept, you're probably going to have to re-architecture some stuff a bit. And I think that again's one of the key sort of design principles at the start is, what are you going to lift and shift with minimal change, and what are you going to re-architect so it works best in the cloud? And I guess we can probably come up with analogies of the difference of these kind of things. But really, it's if I lift and shift something, don't change it, and it works in a suboptimal way on the cloud, I'm going to have to live with that pain for a long time. So it might be worth that investment in. Let's say, for argument's sake, you had a pipeline component that did something in a streaming fashion. You might decide, maybe that bit there goes in a data factory, and I get to trigger that. Let's say there's a file on my SFTP server, my logic app detects the file, but then it calls and triggers a data factory pipeline that goes and, which would handle processing big data in a different way to what a logic app would. That would give you significant advantages. And then you can maybe break that data up in the pipeline, and then the logic app sees the pipeline's finished and then goes and does other stuff after it. And that's understanding about how you can sort of connect. So, Azure Integration Services being like a bunch of Lego bricks that you can connect together to build your solution. And that really solved the problem that we always had with BizTalk, where it was a big box with a bunch of stuff in, but it was all cobbled together. And we didn't have the flexibility, whereas now we've got infinite flexibility almost. It's just knowing which building block to use to solve which problem. I think is the opposite trade-off challenge,
Yeah, for sure. And I think as people do look at the reusability needs, like certainly if they're not familiar with Azure API management, I think that's a great piece of advice, is to go check that out. I think functions is sort of another opportunity, right? Where if you've got common code that you want to centralize and then expose it so that you can reuse it, those would be another angle. And I think the last piece of advice is great as well. And that's kind of like rethinking the problem. It was kind of funny. A good friend of all of ours, Richard Seroter, who spent a lot of time in this space, he recently had tweeted me because he had saw that we put out this content, even though he's working for another big company. But he's kind of like, I'm not a big fan of migration sort of wizards, because it will sort of can take the sins of the past and kind of move them forward in some scenarios. And I think your analogy of Data Factory is solid, where you do want to take a look at some of these things, and where it makes sense, do take the opportunity to modernize the approach, because who knows when the next time is for you to like circle back and do it. So I think there's some things like the maps and schemas that you don't necessarily want to change because that might not add value. But if there's other opportunities, do take advantage of the re-architecture opportunity.
That really comes back to the inventory of what you've got, doesn't it? So like if we think about, there's always been this argument that most BizTalk solutions are really quite simple, where they're just moving files around and transforming data. And for those kind of ones, they should be pretty simple. And really what you want to do is go, let's migrate it with the least amount of effort so it just works. And that really was what the driver for the migration wizards was about taking let's say that 80% of solutions that are dead simple, can we migrate them and just get them done and out of the way, so that the time you invest with your skilled people is really about getting better value for money for those those interfaces. I mean, if I look at some of the logic apps we've got, if we knock up the cost of what they would run on consumption, for example, there's some logic apps that cost £3 a month to run, $3 a month, less than $1 a month. But then there's other ones that cost $600 a month to run just for one workflow, and it's because of the different ways that they work and how how you design them. On cloud can have a big difference in terms of cost. This was never really such a problem for BizTalk. You'd have your BizTalk with 2 SQLs and 6 BizTalk nodes, and that was a fairly vanilla bit, and you just had this fixed capacity that most people worked within, and then you'd add another server, you'd take one away. But the cloud's totally different. You've got, especially when you're working with the serverless components, sometimes it just makes sense for a function to be a consumption function because it's used so infrequently, or the cost would be so low. But then there's other times, you really want that elastic premium plan because you'll get better value for money running your certain functions on that node. And the same is true of logic apps. If you've got your app service plan for logic app standard versus your consumption ones, which kind of which approach is best for each interface. And if you're moving one file a day, and you can have a logic app that is going to cost you less than a cup of coffee for the month, that's great. But then there'll be other logic apps where you'll do 1 million a day, and you want it on the app service plan because it's going to cost you a fraction of what it would on consumption.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's jump to the next question. Stephen, we'll give this one to you. How important is it for customers to understand Azure before getting started? What are some resources that you might recommend to help customers upskill in the area of Azure?
Yeah, so from my experience in the past, I've supported that one large BizTalk migration, and I've helped other clients do new greenfield development and Azure integration. It's important to understand the features that are available to you. I don't feel you need to be an expert in functions, for example, in order to understand that functions is part of your solution. So I think the biggest area is to understand what building blocks in Azure do you have to play with, and that's kind of the most important area. My last client, they outlined 15 or so core features that they were going to focus as part of their integration migration. So it's kind of identifying those and being able to understand which ones are out there is definitely a challenge. The documentation on Azure Integration Services is good. Our architecture diagram, or the document that we put together is kind of there to help showcase these new and sometimes legacy Azure features that we can leverage. I find that once you identify the components that you want to use for your solution, narrow it down to 10 or 12 core items. Looking at YouTube videos and Pluralsight videos are definitely useful in diving deeper into these technologies. A lot of them, in order to build 80% of your solution, is pretty straightforward. A lot of times it's very intuitive, especially if you're a BizTalk developer or have any BizTalk experience. A lot of these features are going to just make sense. Logic apps make sense. API management is a little more challenging, but it still conceptually will make sense to people in the integration space. I also try to look at the date of the resource I'm looking at. Features and everything changes so frequently. We're not used to that. I'm in the BizTalk space where we get a new release every 2-3 years. Here it's every 2-3 months, and you have a whole new set of features available to you. So I always looked at the date of my resource. If something's 2-3 years old, that video is probably not going to be very useful going forward. So, but some things are, like I have some Pluralsight courses on logic apps. They're 4 or 5 years old now, but conceptually they're still the same. It's covering the core features of reusing service bus and stuff like that. That stuff hasn't changed. But in terms of how to push the envelope of the new Azure features, making sure you have new content is always important.
And then a couple of the resources I would add to that list. We recently, just before the holiday break here, we had published the Azure Integration Services landing zone. And so for customers that might be new to Azure and they want to have an enterprise deployment of Azure Integration Services, we've got a series of guidance, plus we've got a reference implementation script that allows you to deploy all of these things in less than an hour by clicking a button and populating a few fields. And then we've got the underlying ARM deployment scripts underneath the hood. So that would be a resource. Basically the Tech Community Integrations blog for Logic Apps is obviously a great place to find news. And then also, I think a plug for Mr. Stephenson here. He has an integration playbook, which we will also link out to as well. And he talks a lot about, I think his like factory approach, as he talked about in a lot of these reusable components, and he's got his testing framework. And so we'll be sure to call those resources out in the video description.
I think I've got an old video as well from a couple of years ago. Actually, we should share the link out for, which was talking about BizTalk to Logic Apps, but I think it was called something like "Can I build an enterprise integration platform in 45 minutes?" Where actually DevOps and Terraform the whole platform kind of thing, which would be quite interesting maybe for some people to look at.
Yeah, feel free to give that to me, and I'll make sure to include it. Next question. So we've gone through our inventory. We've identified our reusable components. We've started to build. And then we get to a place where we're like, yeah, we really need to start thinking about operational support because our go live is in front of us, and you definitely do not want to leave that too late. So, Mike, this question would be for you. What should customers be doing about operational support for their go lives?
Yeah. So I guess that think about on Azure is, I mentioned before we've gone from BizTalk where we've got a centralized node or server group that gives us a centralized view of all of our integrations in one place, and that's a good thing. From the perspective of operations, the challenge from the perspective of architecture and development is instead of having a big wide distributed deployment model, you've got this centralized hub you deploy onto. But that makes operations easier. The reverse is true in Azure, where now you've got 10, 15 different Azure resource types that you're using, and the solutions that you build will use bits of each of them working together to solve an interface problem. So it becomes really difficult when, let's say, you've got Logic App function, API management, and a queue being probably the four most common. So if my logical interface that solves a business problem combines all of those, how do I operate that when I've got all these different bits to look at? So one of the good things, particularly, first off, let's say with Logic Apps, the great thing is the run history compared to BizTalk. We had the orchestration debugger, we had HAT or whatever it was called more recently, but they were a bit rubbish, let's face it. They weren't the most user-friendly. Run history is great because it shows you exactly what the Logic App did. So that those patterns where you're building a workflow that orchestrates a bunch of APIs, queues, and a couple of connectors, it's really easy to see what's going on, which is it's a huge thumbs up for Logic Apps. The challenge really becomes, how do I know which one of the 100,000 Logic Apps ran today was the one that was processing order 5, which failed? And how do I know which of those 100,000 failed? That's the big challenge on Azure. Now, there's a couple of things you can do. Obviously, you've got tracked properties. You can, and one of the good things is a lot of the assets, so things like functions, APIM, and Logic App Standard all use App Insights. With Logic App Consumption, you can use log analytics. So you've got the ability to get that data into a place you can start querying it and build queries and see what's going on, which is good. So that idea of how do I find which Logic App it is, you can start to solve that problem. And you can start to get these distributed tracing views across components. So I did a video for the bootcamp, integration bootcamp last year, which talked a lot about this, but I don't think the recording was ever released. So I've got a plan to do that again because I think it's a really important, like a base skill that people need to know is you need to know how to leverage things like App Insights. Now, the trade-off is, with App Insights and log analytics, you're going to get a mountain of data gets streamed into it from these things if you want everything. And you've got challenges around, what do they call it? Sampling.
The sampling.
Yeah. So when you get into a sampling scenario, you start losing some of that telemetry, which makes it challenging as well. So you've got to think about those things. But And then you've also got, other great things is a lot of these resources have the ability to set up Azure monitor alerts and that kind of thing. They're quite difficult to configure because one of the problems is that they're all, like all of these different resources are all separate things. So you don't get that centralized view like you would get in BizTalk, which is the one trade-off. Everything's very, very decentralized. So you can go into a Logic app, you can configure an alert, you can use the metrics, but it's all just that one workflow. And I think, to be honest, Kent, feedback for the product teams, I think standard Logic apps have still got a bit of a way to go to catch up to consumption around the metric API support. But the app insights stuff's come along really good, and I know you've got some good plans around that. And then, you can build things like dashboards in Azure to get those views about what's going on. You've got really, best thing on Logic apps, the resubmit. So if you can, you get an error, you can resubmit it. It's so much easier than BizTalk was back in the day. So you've got some good things in there, and then obviously you've got third-party products that can help you. I guess we'll not go into them too much on the call, but there's definitely some good additions you can look at to help things out.
Nope, sounds good. So I guess we'll start to wrap up here a little bit, but I guess is there anything else you would like to add to the conversation that we might have missed? And then also, where might people find you? And I'll be sure to include your details in the description. So Stephen, maybe let's start with you. If there's anything you feel we've missed that you should that people should be aware of.
Yeah, well, I think we want to make sure we point out the importance of DevOps in our solutions. I like to think first of how I'm going to deploy what I'm going to build before I actually build it. As we've kind of mentioned, the low code, no code approach to a lot of these artifacts. So building the solution itself isn't necessarily the hard part, but being able to reliably and repeatedly deploy that solution to multiple environments, because you're going to have dev test, prod. That's really the bread and butter of your integration solution. Knowing that you have 100% confidence I can hit resubmit today and redeploy that whole solution, and it's going to work, exactly as is. There's a lot of integrations always been complicated to deploy because we're dealing with so many different third-party usernames and passwords and access, stuff like that. So understanding the DevOps of how to deploy is important. And not everything's going to be a scripted deployment. Things like Key Vault, a lot of times, it's very sensitive. You just go into the portal, you define it once in your subscription for that Key Vault value, and then it sets. And, make sure you have a resource or a team, that's dedicated to doing that has those secrets, and make sure those are updated. So I think the DevOps side is very important, and definitely something that people want to make sure they have a resource and dedicate resources to that.
No, it makes sense. We hadn't talked about that, and I think that's another one of those foundational activities that should happen earlier than late. You don't want to be deploying 4 or 5 different Logic app solutions manually, and then all of a sudden then figure out what your DevOps process. So I think that's a great piece of advice. How about you, Mike?
Well, I think on that DevOps piece, one of the things we've always tried to do on projects that I've been involved in is kind of make the DevOps process a cookie cutter approach. So you crack the problem once, and then you copy and paste it for the other solutions, or you share the assets and try and make it as common as possible. But I think that the good thing is that BizTalk binding files were way more complicated than Logic app deployments. Which is a good thing, but you do, integration always has lots of config settings. I think the one, let's talk about the maybe 3 things I'd like to mention. One's a really good thing. One's, I think, just to be aware of this because it might bite you. And one's, I think, I'll touch on it then. So the really good thing is security. The big win on Azure Integration Services, BizTalk Server security was challenging to do well. And especially connected with different assets. Now, the good thing we've got in Azure is we're talking to a lot of different Azure assets that make up our platform, but also things that are outside of our integration platform domain. Now, because we've got things like managed identities, that lets us do this passwordless authentication to things like SQL, to API management, to queues. getting to know how that works is a really good thing for people to do, because it can take away a lot of your config security problems around managing connection strings, managing secrets and that kind of thing. And it's also just it's a much more solid, robust thing. And you know, if you were audited, you'd get a lot more ticks in the box, and you'd have a lot less pain by doing that. And once you've got it cracked of how to do it, you'll just be doing it all the time. So I think that's a good thing. The second thing was just like I always kind of say to people, look, right, the biggest challenge around Azure Integration Services is going to be the networking elements, you know, over time. So 10 years ago when we were doing cloud, people weren't really worrying too much on platform as a service about networking concepts. It was all, you know, serverless type ideas and components talk to each other. Now people are doing a lot more networking and have been for a few years. So the chances are for most integration customers, you're going to have to connect your logic apps, your API management, your functions to a VNet and have that network isolation. So that brings in, you know, if we think back to BizTalk infrastructure setups, what made it really challenging was that I needed an AD person, a SQL DBA, server admins, BizTalk admins, and you know, you needed all these different specialist skills working together. And with consumption logic apps, you know, again, if we think of the timeline, a number of years ago, people were building consumption logic apps, and a lot of those infrastructure skills weren't really part of the game anymore, which was a big win for productivity. But now that you're going to find that they're much more in the game again, and you need to plan to deal with that. And there's pros and cons, you know, let's face it, it makes it harder. But at the same time, you've got extra security things. My biggest thing that I would like Microsoft to do is to take away the networking problem for me. Because if I can say, here's all my resources, either in this resource group, in this subscription, make them talk on a private network to each other, and just magically make them talk into my network without me having to configure this every time I build a logic app, that would be the biggest win for customers, because that problem just makes everything so much harder to do. So I think that's the thing people need to make sure you don't forget to think about that, because it'll bite you. Now, the good thing with the logic app is some of your logic apps you might decide you don't need network connectivity on them, and some of them you do. So maybe one of the things with logic app standard is you might start separating orchestration workflows from data access workflows. So you might have workflows that are stateless and just talk to a system, have network connectivity set up on them, and then you may have other ones that just sit and orchestrate across those data services, and and you might not have the networking challenge to deal with on every single logic app you build. But that's a design question people need to think about. But don't forget that. But then the final point was think about the skill sets in your company. So Stephen touched on this before, and I think this is a lot about how the roles we play have changed over the years. So when I build interfaces now, so Kent mentioned Josh before coming in as a grad with very little dev experience, starts building logic apps really quickly, but also, resource bottlenecks are a big challenge for organizations, but I can build APIs and I can build functions with vanilla .NET skill sets. I don't need integration experts to do them. So you can actually span your team out and get more resources to help you build integration solutions who don't have to be part of the integration team all the time. And that allows people like me and Stephen and other integration specialists to focus on that integration center of excellence idea, where they would see this is how we do stuff. But then you can have a wider pool of people who would work within the, color within the lines kind of idea to build your integration solutions. And then you can just get a bigger team delivering more value without having to have this huge army of experts. You might have a smaller number of experts and then a wide number of generalists who are, some of the organizations I've worked with, we've got Power Platform people who build logic apps, we've got .NET developers, JavaScript guys. They all can come in and, participate as part of the integration team from a sort of a matrix perspective, like they come in, do some stuff, and then they go back and build their web apps or whatever, which I think is a great thing for making integration easier for companies to do,
Absolutely. No, some some real nuggets there. I'm glad we asked that question. So I guess thank you both for participating in this video. I think this is, there's no substitute for like the real world expertise that you both clearly bring. If people wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way to go ahead and do so?
Yeah, so for me, email's kind of the best. It's Stephen, Stephen, at stephenwthomas.com. It's the same Twitter handler as well, if you want to reach out to me there.
I think for me, probably LinkedIn's probably the best thing because, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, then we can chat and people might see, I share a lot of blog posts that I do and other content on LinkedIn. It's probably the best way. I'm on Twitter, but I don't really kind of do social media as much now, but LinkedIn's a great thing,
Yeah, I'll second that one. LinkedIn is a great choice as well.
Cool. Well, I'll be sure to put links to both of your LinkedIn profiles in the video description as well. All right, so that's it for this video. Thanks everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment, and we'll catch you later.
Take care. Thanks, Ken.